Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics. Today, this is Joe Moore, joined by Dr. Andrew Weil. How are you today, sir?
I'm good.
So it's not often we get somebody with such a legacy and esteem to join us on the show. So I'm really excited that you are taking the time to be with us here and dig in.
Happy to be here.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit. Could you give us a little bit of a background on yourself in terms of biography?
Sure.
Short as you want or long as you want.
Okay. I grew up in Philadelphia. I was a botany major at Harvard in the 1960s and had the good fortune to be mentored by Richard Evans Schultes, who was head of the Harvard Botanical Museum and considered the godfather of modern ethnobotany and a major scholar of Amazonian hallucinogenic plants. And that got me interested in really a career interest in medicinal plants and psychoactive plants. I then went to Harvard Medical School. I did an internship in San Francisco. Then pretty much dropped out of medicine because I was very disillusioned with the way I saw it practiced, and I had learned nothing about healing and health. Made my living as a writer for a number of years, traveled around the world, looked at alternative methods of healing, at plants, gradually put together my own system, which I first called natural and preventive medicine and then came to call integrative medicine. And I now direct a center of excellence at the University of Arizona College of Medicine. It's called the Andrew Weil Center for Integrative Medicine. We train physicians and other health professionals. We're really the leader in education in this new system, which really focuses on all the things that doctors should have learned in medical school but didn't, including botanical medicine and nutrition. There's tremendous interest in the people we train now in psychedelics. And that's been also a long-term interest of mine. I first took mescaline in 1960, so a long time ago, when I was an undergraduate at Harvard. I've experimented with most of the major psychedelics. I've studied with shamans who use them in South America, and I'm tremendously interested in their potential at the moment for therapeutic use and ceremonial use. And actually, if I think about it, I would say I'm really interested in the possibility that they can save the world. I don't see many other things out there that can do that.
I try not to say it too often, but I do say it. So, are you're effectively the architect of integrative medicine? Did you have partners you were working with?
I think I coined that term, and it's been interesting to watch. It really is becoming mainstream. It's an accepted term now in academic discourse. There are textbooks of integrative medicine. There are, many medical schools have programs in integrative medicine. I have always said that one day we'll be able to drop the word integrative. It'll just be good medicine.
And I've been meeting a lot of osteopaths recently, DOs, and I find them to have almost been like the precursor to this integrative medicine.
Yeah, unfortunately, most osteopaths today are indistinguishable from MDs, but the original ones, the ones who really rely on osteopathic manipulation, I think that's a wonderful methodology. And one of my main mentors was a fantastic osteopathic healer, Robert Fulford, who I found in Tucson. He was a master of cranial therapy, and I think the most effective healer I've ever seen. So I think in its origins and philosophy, osteopathic medicine is much closer to integrative medicine.
Yeah, amazing. And I've been hearing rumblings that it might even explode in the home of Walmart, like Bentonville, Rogers, Arkansas. I heard there's some big action there. Is there anything you can share about that? Do you know anything about that?
Well, I'm not totally in the know about that, but
Yeah.
the family that the Walton family behind Walmart, that some members are very interested in integrative medicine, and actually I think are starting a medical school in Arkansas.
That's amazing. Yeah, we have some boots on the ground there, and we're
Good.
very
Good.
interested. Not at the medical center, in the locality. So we want to
Great.
make sure psychedelics make their way in there, hopefully.
Excellent.
Yeah, that'll be fun. So you and I had a conversation a little while ago, 3 or 4 years ago, about declining toad populations. We've been seeing it at that point. It wasn't even fever pitch yet. Fever pitch is like right now, it seems like, but declining toad populations probably due to over harvesting, climate change, overdevelopment.
All that.
Yeah, it's really tough.
I don't get acknowledged for this, but Wade Davis, my longtime friend and colleague, also from the Harvard Botanical Museum, and I were the first people to write about the psychoactive toad of the Sonoran Desert and publish it in a scientific journal. That was really a long time ago. Before most.
This is before the famous pamphlet that came out.
Yeah, right shortly after that.
Right
but
on.
I lived in an area east of Tucson in Weil, bordering on Saguaro National Park, and that was prime bufo alvarius habitat. And on summer evenings, there'd be dozens and dozens of them hopping around outside my back door and sometimes inside my back door. Quite amazing animals. And now they have become fairly rare for all the reasons that you've mentioned. And I really discourage people from harvesting toads and milking them. I think the synthetic 5-methoxy DMT gives pretty much the same experience, and that there's no justification for going after the animals or keeping them in captivity.
Yeah, the data is clear. One of our advisors, Malin Uthog, wrote a paper at Maastricht University comparing the subjective experience, and it was identical. Better dosing too,
but pretty much the same.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and the dosing is way better. It's massively variable in toad, and yeah. So folks, please stay away from it. And you were having toads come in your house too. And...
they would hop in. They're enormous. They're the size of footballs.
Oh my God,
and,
really?
You'd pick them up. The first thing they do when you pick them up is they pee on you. And then it's fairly easy to milk the venom from them. And it doesn't hurt the toad, as far as I can tell, to milk the venom and, put them back outside. They're just eating machines. They're just constantly eating all the time. And it's just sad that you go out in these habitats now and they're really hard to see them.
Mm. And is it true that this substance was kind of well, not really researched, but experimented with before people found out about the toad?
Well, I think there was more research and interest in regular DMT, not the 5-methoxy form. NN-dimethyl DMT is the one that causes intense visual, hallucinations. But in South America, the two compounds occur together in a number of plants that native peoples use mostly as hallucinogenic snuffs. In the toad, and this is the only example that we have of a psychedelic that comes from an animal source. But in the toad, it's just the 5-methoxy form of DMT. And both of them now have been, I think, intensively researched. And it's also possible that DMT is our own endogenous psychedelic because it's very close to melatonin, which is secreted by the pineal gland, and serotonin, one of our neurotransmitters. So, I think that is something we make in us and may account for some extraordinary experiences that people have.
I was having a conversation years ago with a brilliant, maybe too brilliant biochemist talking about how you could set up the body for more endogenous experiences through practice, supplementation, and other things. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
He's a hardcore Tibetan Buddhist as well, so I'm sure he had some secret sauce there. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. So mescaline, peyote, same problem these days too. So folks should probably stay away from that one. But,
although I hear, I'm very pleased. I'm friends with the River Styx Foundation.
Great.
And they have a project to conserve peyote. They've bought up land in its natural habitat and are planning more of it. So that's a very good thing to see people doing.
It's promising. Yeah, I'm really hopeful by that whole constellation of projects there. It's really great.
Yeah.
A lot of tribal involvement too. I love that too.
Good thing.
Yeah, it's tough though, because we see the success of like low alcoholism rates and this, but I think we can maybe make a tangential jump over to San Pedro or something a little less scarce.
Sure. Right.
Yeah. So I guess backing up and getting maybe a little more high level, what is it maybe about psychedelics that make you so hopeful or interested?
I don't know anything else that is so readily available and that can, with at least, some attention to how you do them, has such a potential to change how people interpret their perceptions and interpret their experience of the world around them. I mean, I've seen just such dramatic changes in people and in myself as a result of psychedelic experience. And we're in pretty bad shape these days. I don't think that takes a lot of discussion. But it seems like we're really headed, for disaster. And I think only a change. I've written about this from long ago. My first book, The Natural Mind, that was published in 1972, said that only a global change in consciousness could really transform, our world. And I think that the psychedelic revolution has the potential to do that.
Mm, right. And
For
yeah,
example, just one example, if you look at what's happening with climate change and the clear direction we're headed there, I think when people in psychedelic states really experience themselves as totally connected with nature and understand that, the ways they think really influences what's out there, that there just is a natural motivation to take greater responsibility, for how we impact the environment.
yeah, there's a good series from like 2005 to 2012 where all of my breathwork and psychedelic experiences were very nature oriented and
Hmm.
climate collapse oriented. So I feel it very personally too.
Yeah.
Yeah. And at this time, like when you were exploring psychedelics in the 70s, were you friendly with Paul Stamets, like as he was coming up?
Yeah, I met him when he was a pretty young kid. We went to some of the very early mushroom conferences, so I think I've known him for something like 45 years. And when I first met him, he was only interested in magic mushrooms, and I got him interested in the medicinal properties of mushrooms as well. And that's become a major, theme of his work and his business and his life. So we've been working together and known each other, traveled together for a very, very long time.
And this is tangential, but kind of in that theme. So how were you pulling from like Japanese Chinese literature on mushrooms?
Yeah, well, let's see. I first got interested in wild mushrooms and learning about them and collecting them in the 1970s. I was in the Pacific Northwest, which was a good place to do that. And I was also at that time very interested in traditional Chinese medicine, which was not very well known in this country. And in reading about traditional Chinese medicine, I was struck by the fact that there was such emphasis placed on mushrooms as remedies, whereas in the West, we've completely ignored them as potential medicines. And that seemed very odd to me as more I thought about it, because first of all, um, mushrooms have very unusual chemistry. They've got compounds in them not found elsewhere in nature. So if you want to look for new drugs, you'd look to an area of nature where there's unusual compounds. Secondly, there's a lot of toxins in mushrooms, not necessarily deadly ones, but toxins of one sort or another. And the only difference between a medicine and a toxin is dose. So, if you look at areas of nature where there's toxins, you're likely to find potential new drugs. And then there's the fact that they were so prominent in East Asian medicine. And finally, the greatest success of modern pharmaceutical medicine in the past 100 years has been the discovery of antibiotics from very closely related organisms, what we call lower fungi, mold. So for all those reasons, it didn't make sense that Western scientists had not looked to mushrooms as sources of new medicines. And I think that has to do with what Gordon Wasson called mycophobia, the irrational fear of mushrooms that's very prevalent in the West, especially in English speaking cultures. So I began talking about the medicinal potential of mushrooms, got Paul interested in it. I met with scientists in Japan and China who were studying them, began writing about that. And, I'm very pleased to see that this has become quite a robust field of research and, a lot of interest now in the potential of these things. And a lot of them have unique effects that we don't have pharmaceutical drugs for. For instance, lion's mane, mushrooms, which appears able to stimulate nerve growth and improve cognitive function. That's a unique effect. A number of these mushrooms um, make you more resistant to infection and to cancer, and are completely non-toxic. And so, very useful things.
Yeah, it's amazing. I heard recently that pharmacists in Europe, like particularly Germany, are actually getting botanical training as well, but that's just not here. Is that
No, it is not here. When I was an undergraduate and studying at the Harvard Botanical Museum, we had a number of lecturers who were from colleges of pharmacy. And at that time, there was a field that was taught in pharmacy colleges called pharmacognosy, uh, which to me was the living heart of pharmacy. It's the science of the discovery and recognition of new drugs from natural sources. It was really and it was the connection between pharmacy and nature and medicine. And about probably 10 or 15 years after I got out of school, pharmacognosy was dropped as a required subject in all American colleges of pharmacy. And that was a real shame. It was the severing of the last link between nature and the medical sciences. And I have great respect for pharmacists, and I think that I always, when I lecture
they're
to
amazing?
physicians, I tell them, you want to form partnerships with pharmacists because they can advise you about interactions between pharmaceutical drugs and over the counter products, and potentially with all the natural things as well, if they learned about them. So they've got to get up to speed in that area.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I think pharmacists are totally under recognized here, and I hope to make
Yeah.
a dent. There's
By
a
the
new
way,
psychedelic pharmacist association.
In Germany and some of those other European countries, France, I think as well, pharmacists will identify mushrooms. So if you go out and collect wild mushrooms, you can bring them into the pharmacy, and the pharmacist will tell you whether they're edible or not.
That's incredible.
Yeah,
I love that. Yeah, the new Psychedelic Pharmacist Association is trying to network these folks. So there will be hopefully a lot more knowledgeable
is
pharmacists
that in
coming online.
existence now?
Yeah.
Oh, tell me about it. I
Hmm.
don't know about it.
There's it's small right now. There's maybe I don't want to even estimate. I would guess around 20 or 30 members. Founded in Oregon. Regina Moore, who's a pharmacist up there, I think she was doing a lot of the initial work.
Hmm.
And there's a couple others, like Ben Malcolm in Los Angeles is calls himself the spirit pharmacist. So he's been
Huh.
up on this stuff for a long time too,
Oh,
putting
great.
out a lot of good CE material for pharmacy folks.
Good. Glad to hear it.
Yeah, it's incredible. I'm happy to hear that as well. So is your the Center of Excellence in Integrative Medicine named by yourself? Is that in Phoenix or Tucson?
Tucson, the University of
Okay.
Arizona is in
Okay.
Tucson, so it's with the College of Medicine here.
Great.
And as I said, we do research, we offer some clinical services, which we hope to expand, but mostly our focus is on education. Our main program is a 2-year intensive fellowship for physicians and nurse practitioners, and we've graduated 3,000 fellows from that training program. They're in practice in all states in the U.S. and in other countries. And if people go to our website, which is integrativemedicine.arizona.edu, there's a find a practitioner link, and you can find one of our graduates in your area. You can look by specialties. We also have great online courses, some for the general public, in areas of nutrition and botanicals and so forth.
That's amazing. Um, and how many people do you put through that program, do you think?
Well, we usually have 3 classes going through at one time of about 80 people each. And that's just one program. We have another program called Integrative Medicine in Residency, which is a condensed curriculum that's a required accredited part of residency training. It's now been adopted by, I think, 100 residency programs in the US and Canada. And, the goal is eventually that this will be part of residency training in all specialties. So one day, whether you go to a psychiatrist or a gastroenterologist or a dermatologist, that person will have learned the basics of nutrition and health, about botanicals, about the interactions of the mind and body, and maybe even about the potentials of psychedelic therapy.
Are you familiar with the work Dr. Charles Nichols is doing around inflammation with this substance DOI?
No, and I'd love to know about that because I've been very focused on inflammation. I was one of the first people to write about the possibility that chronic low-level inflammation is the root cause of, most of the serious chronic diseases, diseases of aging. And I developed an anti-inflammatory diet for that purpose. And I've, been looking at the anti-inflammatory potential of a number of natural products like turmeric and green tea. But no, I'd love to know more about that.
Yeah, so I was trying to bring those three together. Perfect. So he's doing some really interesting work with low dose DOI, I believe even non psychoactive dose levels, and there's extraordinary response, neuroinflammation wise, full body inflammation wise. And I don't know where they're at. It's probably preclinical at this point.
Huh.
So not in humans yet, I believe,
Yeah.
but it's looking really hopeful. So, I believe orders of magnitude more potent anti-inflammatory than psilocybin and LSD would be. Which I know
Wow.
that
Okay.
check
Maybe
him out.
you connect me with him, and I'd love to know more about that.
Yeah, he's a really amazing guy, doing really stellar work.
Great.
Yeah, and turmeric, obviously, like this is I think how I bumped into you years ago, probably in my undergrad. I'm looking up dietary stuff, lifestyle
Uh-huh.
change, and you're preaching the healthy lifestyle gospel, and turmeric was a big part of that.
Yeah.
Um, was this the Okinawa?
Yeah. I've always used turmeric in modest amounts in cooking, but I made a number of trips to Okinawa in the I think 1980s, 1990s, when I was doing research for a book on healthy aging, because Okinawa at that time had the greatest concentration of centenarians in the world. And when I was there, a very common beverage was cold, unsweetened turmeric tea. It's hot and humid in Okinawa, and it was very pleasant to drink that. And it turned out to be made from a fermented form of turmeric, which is much more palatable than just dissolving the turmeric you'd buy in a grocery store in water. So I was very interested in bringing that into this country and turning people onto it. I tried that. It was really ahead of its time, and now I've just started to do that again. And I'm affiliated with I started a company, Matchakari. The website is matcha.com. Mostly we bring in very high quality matcha from Japan, but we recently started selling this fermented turmeric from Okinawa. I think we're the only people that distribute that. And it's just delicious. I mean, I just dissolve it in cold water and drink it unsweetened. But you can put it into anything you want.
All right, I'm sold. Now, the turmeric topic, before we get more into matcha,
Yeah.
new data came out recently about what was it, liver damage on account of like contaminated supply from some vendors. Have you heard this one?
Right. Yeah.
What can we do to be safe with?
Well, I think that's a general question. It applies to things like medicinal mushrooms and, a lot of herbal products. You have to know
Hmm.
the supplier, and you have to get assurances about the quality, especially where they source things from. I'm generally suspicious of all natural products coming from China. I think there's a very high percentage that are contaminated either with agrochemicals or heavy metals. Um, I would prefer to get products grown in the States if you can get them, and from companies that adhere to good manufacturing practices and can really assure you that, there are not contaminants there.
Yeah, that's important. And what are we seeing with matcha? Is that similar anti-inflammatory, or is it just a nice
Yeah,
coffee alternative? Or
we have a lot of data on tea in general and green tea in particular. Been many population studies. Green tea is very high in antioxidants and in compounds called flavonols, which have protective effects on the body. And matcha has a higher content of these than other forms of green tea. Because of the way it's grown, it is, in the several weeks before harvest, the plants are heavily shaded, 90% shade. So most of the light is cut out. And in response to that, the leaves grow bigger and thinner and produce more chlorophyll, trying to make more energy. And they also produce more of these defensive compounds in plants. So matcha, and also with matcha, you're ingesting the whole leaf. It's the only form of tea in which you consume the whole leaf. It's the whole powdered leaf. And it has a higher content of all of these substances, including an amino acid called L-theanine, which has a relaxing, calming effect and modifies the effect of caffeine. So I think the stimulant effects of matcha and of coffee are quite different. Matcha does not have the jangling effect of coffee. And many people say it produces calm alertness. And I think, that is a good thing.
Calm alertness. You
Yeah.
heard it here first. That's not how I feel after a pot of coffee.
Right.
Yeah. Cool. So I'll experiment with that. I've been trying to cut caffeine, but if a healthy caffeine can come back in, hell yeah.
Well, try matcha. I know many people actually that have
Mhm.
weaned themselves off coffee by, phasing in matcha, at least for some of it.
Mm. Yeah. Very cool. And are there, so with these, you said flavonoids and L-theanine, like, is there, like, beyond the relaxation, is there other nutritional benefits from like the chlorophyll or consuming the whole leaf?
I don't know about chlorophyll, but all of these other compounds, I think they protect cardiovascular health. They protect against cancer. They are anti-inflammatory. They protect the nervous system. So I think these are beneficial compounds. There was just a some news articles that went around about what's being called the green Mediterranean diet. I don't know whether you've seen that. It's a modification of the Mediterranean diet to increase the flavonol content of foods. And so and one of the main additions was green tea. I think it was recommended that people drink 4 cups of green tea a day, as well as increased consumption of berries, and certain other plants.
And is it possible to get similar benefit from green teas and matcha if they're decaffeinated in some way?
Probably.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Although it's not very easy to decaffeinate matcha, so and the quality of it is not terrific.
Right. Okay. Good to know. So yeah, I think I'm going to dig into that quite a bit. It's interesting because you've kind of discovered it quite early. Now you're seeing it at like every coffee shop now, matcha lattes and whatnot.
I first discovered it. I went to Japan when I was 17 in 1959 and lived with Japanese families. And the second night I was there, I was turned on to matcha and fell in love with it. And when I got back to the States, I couldn't get it. And then when I was going to Japan, there was a period where I was going frequently. I'd always bring it back, turn friends onto it. In the 1980s, I formed a partnership with a Japanese matcha company, tried to sell it through my website. It was way too early to do that. And anyway, now it is wonderful. I'm quite pleased to see, how it has taken America by storm.
Yeah, it's fantastic to see healthy alternatives being introduced, from our, sad diet, right? It's
Right.
How can we get people healthier? It's, we need a consciousness shift, we need a dietary shift, lifestyle shift, and it's big.
Well, it's all tied together. It's
Mm-hmm.
all, as I said, it's all rooted in the nature of consciousness and how we think, and as that changes, our behavior changes.
I remember reading some book about the Grateful Dead's early kind of commune situation, and I don't know if it's a commune, just kind of some sort of weird group living, and they were all macrobiotic early, which was a pretty big trend back then.
Yeah, I remember that quite well.
Yeah. And it was just interesting seeing these kind of psychedelic heads, bringing in these dietary shifts. I barely remember Tim Leary talking about diet change.
No, I don't remember any of that.
Yeah. And Terrence McKenna, maybe here and there,
Maybe,
but I don't really remember it either. Obviously critiquing culture, but yeah, maybe that was just assumed. Yeah. So I think we are seeing a really major acceleration in psychedelic awareness. And as a result, I think a lot of these healthy lifestyle changes are also being investigated, maybe not being adopted, but at least being looked at. And
before the pandemic, when I was traveling around a lot and speaking, everywhere that I lectured, whether it was on nutrition, healthy aging, integrative medicine, I would get questions about psychedelics. people want to know, where can I get them? How can I use them? How can I find psychedelic guide? And that has only increased. And even in the health professionals that we train at our center, tremendous interest and demand for information about it. And we are in the process of developing a curriculum on psychedelic medicine.
That's fantastic.
Online.
Yeah, that's our primary business too, is education for healthcare, therapy, all sorts of clinicians. And found out recently some of our content was being used at Stanford, and that felt like a big win.
Now, there are some people, I know people who use psychedelics ceremonially and work with native peoples who are not happy about the medicalization and use in therapy. My feeling is that, let everything bloom. However it's used, I think it's a good thing.
I've met people in the Native American church who are, both seriously against and seriously for this.
Right.
It's, not a uniform opinion, unfortunately.
Yeah, good.
And it's, well, I guess maybe it's fortunate to not have uniform opinions, but yeah, it's hopeful. This is one of the biggest healthcare wins, in my opinion, for the planet, if we can make this happen, right? It's, how do I stop stress eating Big Macs?
The momentum, I think, can't be stopped now. And it's only a question of, how soon we can get all these things out of Schedule 1 under federal law. It certainly looks as if MDMA will be, made available for treatment of PTSD very soon.
It looks like late 24, maybe.
For drug-resistant depression. And that's clearly going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those two at the very least, but I see no reason why the rest of them will come through.
Absolutely.
It's like, do you have any speculation on, why, like, you were living in this decade, that all the tumult was happening? Like, is there a strong why for why it just kind of got cracked down from your perspective?
In the very early days, which I lived through, when there was a lot of enthusiasm about using LSD particularly, and mushrooms. There was great data on benefits in terminal cancer patients and incarcerated prisoners. I mean, really, people were enthusiastic about these things. And then I think as the whole counterculture movement developed, they were so strongly associated with counterculture and alternative lifestyles, it made the general public afraid. And it was really that fear response that led to the criminalization of them. But the absurdity of putting these in Schedule 1. Schedule 1 is defined as, having high potential for abuse and no therapeutic potential. I mean, how ridiculous. So we got to get them out of there. And also, there's one-way movement in drug scheduling. Things can go from, less restrictive to more restrictive schedules, but they never move the other way.
Right. So I hope they're working on that. Yeah, I think historically, if we take a look, like the 50s was really stagnant.
Yeah.
Black shiny shoes and, fall in line. And, I think American culture is probably pretty stable from a certain perspective for 100 years or something. And then, historically in Europe, we saw these fringe things happen, and there was pretty draconian actions taken against, what we call them cults, I guess. And and this was probably just the first resurgence of like weird people popping up en masse, and not even really that big of a scene, right? It was just a really good spectacle for media. I'm told there were very few hippies back then. So yeah, that's an interesting one. I'm a board member at this group called the Psychedelic Medicine Coalition, and we're working to actively get federal funds allocated to psychedelic research specifically. Our intelligence tells us that's the best way to get these things rescheduled soon. But TBD, there's other people doing other projects, just trying to bang their doors down saying, this is all a fraud, stop. I don't know if politicians like that.
The press, there's been such favorable reporting about the positive uses of psychedelics. Some months ago, Vogue magazine had a cover story on psilocybin. I mean, unbelievable. Town and Country magazine, of all places, had an article, why is everyone smoking toad venom? I mean, when you see these things, in publications like that, that's just remarkable. And most of the reporting about them has been very positive.
Yeah, I've seen very little negative press, which is
Yeah.
lovely. Um, yeah, I've heard recently rumors that J&J is kind of pushing back on the whole like ketamine thing,
Uh-huh.
putting interesting
Well,
funds.
ketamine, let's talk about that for a
Sure,
moment.
let's get into it.
I'm very interested in that. I wrote a book called From Chocolate to Morphine that you're probably familiar with. It was published in 1983, right as the war on drugs began. And there was a little section on PCP and ketamine. And I wrote about the fact that these two drugs are practically identical. The effects are almost the same, and yet they have such different reputations. PCP was horse tranquilizer. It was associated with, horrible people, whereas ketamine became this drug that was used by intellectuals and psychic explorers, and now has become, so widely used in clinical medicine, such positive things said about it. And to me, it's just an illustration of how the reputations of drugs are very dependent on who gets hold of them, what they do about them. It bothers me to see ketamine referred to as a psychedelic. It is not a psychedelic. It has nothing in common with psychedelics chemically or physiologically or pharmacologically. It's being used as a placeholder in clinics that are waiting for psilocybin, to become available. But I think it's wrong to think of that. It is a dissociative anesthetic. It does not have. It may have, some clinical usefulness in depression, but it does not have that potential for transformation of consciousness that the true psychedelics have.
Yeah, orders of magnitude difference, in my
Yeah.
opinion. Yeah, I'd say dissociative anesthetic with occasional psychedelic
Yeah.
effects. Occasional.
Yeah.
My experiences are pretty weird, but not, I don't know, not really extraordinary. I'm not in a hurry to go back to the
Right.
big doses, IM
Yeah.
or otherwise, right?
Yeah.
It's a fun one. Yeah, and the PCP thing is explicitly racist.
Yeah. Say more.
You familiar with Carl Hart?
No.
Oh, you've got to check him out eventually.
Okay.
He was a former head of psychology at Columbia, and he's a very proud heroin user and other substances. And he wrote a recent book called Drug Use for Grown-Ups. But he, at the Horizons, which is essential reading for all my listeners. So he, at Horizons a number of years ago in New York, played a film of, hey, look, like you can be a white person using ketamine, but if you're a black person using PCP, like the cops are just going to straight up shoot at you.
Huh.
Yeah, and he showed a video in front of this very white audience, which is really, I think, important for the psychedelic exceptionalist to understand what's going on
I
there.
will definitely look that up.
Yeah, he's one of my favorites in the space. He'll be
Great.
we're doing a conference in LA and he's headlining in April. It's going to be fun. So yeah, the racist stuff is fascinating, and people need to understand, like, oh, only these dirty other people use those drugs, and
Yeah.
catch yourself when you say that. But I have a question, because you said psychic explorers. Are you familiar with Marcia Moore, the ketamine
Yes.
explorer?
Yes.
Did you ever get the chance to meet her in Boston?
No, I did not.
Okay. Some of my friends actually spent a bunch of time with her before her untimely demise, but such a fascinating story, using ketamine as this weird tool. She was definitely some sort of prophet with ketamine. Are you familiar with any of that story?
No, I'm not. I'd like to become familiar with it.
I'll see. I think we did a blog a little while ago on it, because she's one of the earliest women in the psychedelic movement to have a really big profile. And I think she was tied in with one of these big families, like the Marriott fortune or something. Yeah, so I'll send you some links later.
Great.
Yeah, Marcia Moore,
Yep.
for the listeners out there, and no relation as far as I know. So very interesting. She ended up, I think there was some speculation that the drug eventually became a god to their whole organization, became like a Kali. And when that kind of thing happens, I think dangerous thing happens when the drug becomes a god.
Interesting.
So folks should watch that too.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I guess beyond inflammation and psychedelics, are there any other big physiological changes under the influence of psychedelics you're aware of that are helpful?
I think they're tremendous, and to me, it all has to do with the mind-body connection. which has been a major theme of my work and a major component of integrative medicine. And this is really distinguishes us from conventional medicine and science, which really ignores the influence of the mind on the body. I think what I've learned from my own psychedelic experience and what I've observed in many other people is that physical reality, including physiology, can change in a moment as a result of a change in consciousness, triggered by a psychedelic. You asked me before we started about my cat allergy story, which is, I think, has been told many times
Tremendous.
and made fun of in an interview I did with 60 Minutes. But this was a very powerful experience for me. It was when I was 28. I had a lifelong cat allergy. If cats got near me, my eyes would itch. If a cat licked me, I'd get hives where it licked me. So I always avoided them. I didn't touch them and, would shoo them away. And one day, I was 28. I was living in the country in Virginia. I took LSD with some friends. It was a beautiful day. It was wonderful. I mean, it was in a terrific state, and I was sitting on the grass and a cat jumped into my lap, and I had an instant defensive reaction. And then I thought, this is silly. I just relaxed and I began petting the cat and playing with it. I did not have an allergic response, and I never have since. I mean, it was an instant disappearance of a lifelong cat allergy as a result of being in this altered state. And I've seen many other experiences of this kind. And to me, there's tremendous potential here for the management of not just allergy, but autoimmune diseases, of many kinds of chronic diseases, chronic pain. People can have the experience that you can not have that. There's a way of being that can make these things change. And by the way, I think that's a very neglected area in all the research and talk about psychedelic therapy. It's all focused on mental, emotional health. And I think there is tremendous potential in physical medicine for the use of these substances.
Yeah, we're investigating some chronic pain stuff ourselves.
Great. Good.
Yeah, and I think the autoimmune one is underexplored. There's a few papers I pulled up the other day. What do you so this is an obnoxious one. So outside the scope of mind body, like what do you think the some sort of mechanism would be on the autoimmune stuff? Or do you think there's just like a lot of kind of trauma and chronic inflammation kind of triggering that?
With autoimmune diseases, the connection between mental, emotional state and the physical disease is so obvious. I mean, I can give you so many examples. With rheumatoid arthritis, this is more common in women, and it often appears in young women. And a typical onset of rheumatoid arthritis in a young woman is a flare-up of all joints within 24 hours of a major emotional trauma. And also, these diseases have tremendous potential to go into remission, which is like great. You want to take advantage of that. I wrote up 2 case studies. I had 2 patients at the same time, so it really caught my attention, who had systemic lupus. They were both women, and middle-aged women. One had major kidney involvement and was in the hospital and not expected to live. The other one had brain involvement and was psychotic. The woman in the hospital had a religious conversion to some variety of fundamentalist Christianity, and the other woman fell in love and subsequently got married, and in both of them the disease disappeared. And I often say I can't often arrange for my patients to have religious conversions or fall in love, but you want that potential is what you want to focus on. That possibility is there.
Yeah, both of those 2 things, religious conversion and falling in love. Psychedelics can do that. It's fun. Yeah, this is more outside the scope of autoimmune. I was chatting with a gentleman the other day who had a lifelong phobia of cracking eggs. One LSD experience, while rafting down some river, he was able to crack an egg and hasn't had that phobia ever since. It's fascinating. I bet we could collect, so many cases and stories of this kind, and researchers should be paying attention to this. This is really important stuff. Right. And you were really big in talking about placebo response and how we should really be studying that, right? I have a friend who thinks this is the end of science. Like all we need to end of medicine is his conviction that we just need to study placebo more. It's because we can do so much with what we've got already.
I agree
Um,
with that. I think the placebo response is the meat of medicine. That's what you want to be trying to make happen. It's pure healing response from within, mediated by the mind and unmixed up with the direct effects of treatment. So I think the goal of medical treatment is to get the maximum healing response with the minimal intervention as determined by the circumstances of illness. And that has a lot to do with how you present treatments to patients, the words you use. But this is to dismiss the placebo response. The commonest way here that word used is things like, how do you know that's not just a placebo response? Or we have to rule out the placebo response. I mean, we should be ruling it in. You want to make it happen more of the time.
right. And that's probably why we're seeing such amazing effect sizes in a lot of these clinical trials around psychedelics.
Definitely.
His his theory is that it's psychedelics are a wild amplifier of placebo, which is
Uh-huh.
interesting. Like, because we could then start saying placebo response equals like inner healer, a la Groff or
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Maps, and it's a fascinating concept.
Yeah, there's an assignment that I like to give to medical students and doctors is to just go into a medical library and at random pull out any journal that reports randomized controlled trials of drugs and pick one article and flip to the end where there's a table summarizing the results. And always in the placebo group, there will be one or two or a small number of individuals who show all of the changes produced in the experimental group. To me, that's the most important finding that's come out of a half century of double blind controlled drug testing, that any change you can produce in the human organism with a pharmaceutical agent can be exactly reproduced in some people some of the time purely by a mind mediated mechanism. I mean, again, that's what we should be focusing on. That's really important.
This is I haven't talked about this book yet on the show, but what's the title? History of Scientific Revolutions.
Uh-huh.
So,
Yeah.
talking all about paradigmatic change. And
Mhm.
this is exactly that. You look at these outliers and you go, why? This
Yep.
model doesn't explain that. So,
Exactly.
how do we make a bigger model to include all of our findings? And I think that also
You,
is
you,
kind of leading into transpersonal psychology, too.
yeah, you don't do
Yeah.
it by ignoring the outliers.
Yeah, like I think what the project they're working on is a high level of predictability
Mhm.
for a large portion of people, not necessarily explaining things.
Right.
Some are, but some
Right.
aren't. And I think that's
Yeah.
just the drug development paradigm we're in right now.
Yeah.
But I hope there's people working on that. I saw a recent article criticizing the hell out of faith healing, but doing a comparative analysis to the psychedelic movement at this point and how it looks a lot similar at a certain point and scale. I'm like, to some degree, yes, but also, what is it? Like, some faith healing did work, you know?
Exactly.
Yeah. And, maybe not 90% of people, but a good amount, which is great.
Well,
Yeah.
whenever I get the chance, I talk about these subjects and try to get people interested in studying them because I think it's, a direction that we really want to go in.
Right. So thankfully, we have a lot of young undergrads and master's level students working towards PhDs. And
Yes,
folks, pick
good.
it up. You could
Good.
be the next paradigmatic changer. Hopefully, you're not a total pariah. I think the placebo pariahs are behind us. I think the rest of it's going to be, actual good research and helpful. Yeah.
Good.
So what are some of your other topics that you like to talk about regarding psychedelics or natural products or anything around that?
Oh, geez. I mean, I'm interested in natural products. I'm interested in all aspects of medicine and biology. I'm interested in human animal interactions. I'm really interested in consciousness and the nature of consciousness. One of the great revolutions that I see happening, um, our science and worldview has been so dominated by materialism, and in which consciousness is dismissed as an epiphenomenon and it's something that's a product of brain chemistry. And one of the most powerful experiences I've had on psychedelics is realizing that everything is conscious. That animals are conscious, plants are conscious, inanimate objects are conscious, and that we're all unified by this. That consciousness is primary, and my belief is that consciousness organizes matter into more and more elaborate forms to understand itself. That view has been anathema to scientists. It's now called panpsychism, but it's really
It's a big resurgence in panpsychism.
Yeah, it's gaining traction now. There are very respectable thinkers, who are coming around to that point of view, and I see this as part of the psychedelic revolution.
I love that, and
Yeah.
I just immediately go back to medieval alchemists, and this is exactly the operating system for the most part.
Yeah.
We've evolved it quite a bit. You familiar with Alfred North Whitehead, the British philosopher?
Sure.
Yeah, kind of like an early kind of pseudo panpsychist in a way. Yeah, definitely a little different. But one of our friends, he's at the University of Exeter now. Peter Schwarstead Hughes is doing a lot of really great panpsychism as it relates to psychedelics. And I love that he's doing that work. Really important.
Send me a link for him too.
You got it. I love this. The philosophy, I think, also needs to be expanded here. Like, how do we get people a little bit interested to at least inquire? I don't necessarily want to force people to a certain world.
Yeah, just to be open to
engage.
It.
Yeah,
right.
Look into things. Read some Plato.
Good.
And then you see the talk track. So Plato was a fascist. It's like, cut it out. It was a long time ago. But we can keep iterating and improving. And I'm with you here that this is one of the biggest things. Like, not only do we need this, hang on, before I go on that rant, I had taken a note. Did you write something about this innate human desire to get high at some point?
That was really the main theme of my first book, The Natural Mind. It was that human beings have an innate drive to experience altered states of consciousness. Not necessarily through the use of drugs, although drugs are a very convenient way to do it. One of the examples I gave was of kids learning to spin and until they get dizzy and fall over and the world changed. And that's universal as far as I can tell.
It's still pretty fun as an adult.
So I got a lot of crap from people for saying that there was an innate drive toward altered states of consciousness, but I absolutely believe that. And I think that part of the drug problem in our culture has been our failure to acknowledge that and teach people, safe and better ways of satisfying it.
Exactly. Yeah. We're really big here on safe supply because the drug war has never helped anybody other than prisons and politicians. And
and wars on drugs are always lost.
Endlessly. And at a great cost these days, right? If we were getting safe and tested product, 100,000 less deaths a year from drug ODs likely. And it's a tough one. But I think, these kinds of conversations and getting people familiar with, these concepts help normalize people towards that direction.
Definitely.
Because it's billions of dollars in propaganda we're trying to outstretch here.
Definitely.
Unfortunately, I lost that thread I had before, but I'm glad we hit this one. Have you found any allies in this kind of project around the innate drive to get high?
Oh yeah,
academia or otherwise.
Absolutely. I think that is generally recognized. It's just obvious, that this is, in every culture.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's for whatever reason, I'm like these truths we find self-evident keep coming up for me, and I'm like, how can we do this new psychedelic Bill of Rights or some sort of natural health Bill of Rights?
One day, hopefully not too far in the future.
We just had a major win in Colorado. I assume you saw the news.
Yes.
Yeah. So police now, I think the governor ratified it the other day. But police cannot now take mushrooms if they find it in your pocket or backpack.
Great.
Or DMT, mescaline, or ibogaine, which is a fascinating thing. How do they know it's DMT or ibogaine or whatever?
Ibogaine. Yeah, really. How often do they find those in people's pockets?
Right. It's fascinating. But, in Colorado, pretty mushroom-heavy state. Probably like most places in the country. But, it's a fascinating shift. And it's actually going to open up the underground market in really interesting ways, but also I think make the underground market safer because less secrecy is required now that it's effectively legal. It's you can't really sell it, but you can legally transfer, grow, possess that kind of stuff.
Good to hear.
Thank you very much for your time here. And
yeah, I enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, I'll send you some links
and
in a little bit.
Please send me those links because I want to follow up on that.
You got it. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.